Hello, U.S. history. We're going to be doing a short lecture today on what's happening out west. So you're in luck. It won't be that long. I just want to talk about two important topics. When we look at what is happening as sort of a result of westward expansion and westward settlement. Post-Civil War, because what we're talking about here are things that have happened kind of before the Civil War, but also after the Civil War, and really as more white Americans are moving across the country. So we're going to be looking at clashes in the West. And the first group we have to talk about, of course, is going to be Native Americans. So American Indians. What has been happening really since we began our reservation system? And it starts actually with the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians were the tribes that were settled mainly in the central part of our country. They are forced onto reservations. We learned about the reservation system starting back with President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s with the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act. So we know that reservations are basically pieces of land, usually in undesirable areas or not very good land, that is given to Native Americans, and basically they're forced to live upon those areas and they're not allowed to leave. Of course, as Native Americans, they don't necessarily want to go on these reservations, nor do they want to be forced into areas away from their natural homelands. So there's a series of fights and battles that breaks out really throughout the 1800s. In our textbook, we're going to be looking at what happens pretty much during the Civil War in the 1860s and the 1870s, where the clashes are very violent. But there was a lot of fighting between our U.S. Army and Native Americans. And we have to remember the core of the fighting stems around land. Whether it's Native Americans not wanting to leave their homeland, so they're fighting to remain on what they believe is their land, or fighting to get off a reservation because the land is so terrible and they know that it's not going to be inhabitable for them for very long. Plus, we'll be learning about a story of the Black Hills Territory, where the natives of that region, which is now South Dakota, are forced to live there. They don't want to go, but they finally go. They're on this land. Then all of a sudden, gold is discovered, and now the Americans want them off the land so they can mine for the gold. So there's a lot of constant battles over where Native Americans are allowed to live. As this is happening, the government decides that their best course of action for trying to integrate Native Americans into our society is through a policy that we now call assimilation. Assimilation basically means where you're trying to pretty much take the native culture of someone or a group of people and sort of pull them into or absorb them into your main culture. So here, you see a picture of some Native Americans who are basically dressed in what we would consider Western clothing. And you can see this is not their native style of dress. But this is a very famous picture. There's one similar to it in your textbook regarding this policy of assimilation and, in a way, kind of stripping Native Americans of their native identities. This also comes about because of a famous act called the Dawes Act. And I wrote here on the slide what the act is doing. It's actually going to focus a lot on children. There is some land issues, which your textbook will go into, but I want to focus here in our notes about how this affects Native children. It affects basically starting at a younger age. Many Native children are taken from their parents in the Midwest or the West and sent to the East Coast, places like Philadelphia, for example. And they're sent to school, a boarding school situation. They are taught English. They speak English. They are taught Christianity. They encourage them to be baptized into Christianity. And they change their names. They try to strip these children of their native names and refer to them and use names from the Bible and encourage them to take on more biblical names. So I feel like this is one of our more tragic aspects of our history with Native Americans, is that we're really trying to almost erase their culture and their identity physically. Another group I want to look at are Mexican Americans. And these are Mexican Americans who, by default, were probably at one point part of Mexico living out west. And then after the Mexican American War, they're now absorbed into the United States. There are many Mexican American landowners who are struggling to maintain their lands during westward expansion. And again, these are lands that they have already lived on when it was part of Mexico. Of course, we know with Manifest Destiny and the creation of our Western states, many of these landowners are losing their land. And they fight back. They often resort to warfare because they feel like this is their land, they were there first. And what they're encountering is basically something called squatters, which are, um, I guess you could say, Americans who are moving from the East Coast to the West Coast. And as they're moving across the country, they literally squat and try to live on people's lands for free. So a group of these landowners, Las Goras Blancas, and I'm sorry, my Spanish is so terrible, is a group loosely translating in Spanish to the White Caps, who are basically trying to fight back and create this sort of home and sort of protect the land that we know is theirs. So around the 1880s through the 1890s, this group of Mexican American landowners are literally fighting off white Americans who are trying to steal their land, mainly in New Mexico, but really kind of throughout the Southwest. So we're looking at groups who, I think the whole theme here is that you're looking at groups who own this land in their minds, because in their mind land ownership was residence and living there. There is no paperwork necessarily, but this is their land. They have built on it, they have cultivated it, and our US government is going to say it is not their land, and therefore they have to make room for white Americans as they're coming across. And again, this is where it comes back to racism and looking at people of color or any kind of other than Caucasian ethnicity as inferior, and the fight and it leaves these groups with no other choice but to fight for their lands. I'm going to stop our notes here because we're going to be reading about this in our textbook, and we're going to come back to this issue throughout chapter 5. All right, thanks for listening. Hope you took some good notes.